Hello and welcome to this webinar discussing how rail leaders can better recognise the value of their data and build resilience in 2023. My name is Dom Gibbison. I'm a partner within PA Consulting's transport team and I've spent almost the last 10 years working across the rail sector. This webinar is hosted by Rail Technology Magazine in partnership with PA Consulting. And in today's events, we'll be focusing on three key themes. So first, the practical steps on how rail organisations can extract more value from data and harness it for better decision making. And this will build on some primary research from a recent joint RTM-PA report, which we'll talk about shortly. Second, how to use data to recognise points of failure within your operating model and build resilience. And third, build a wider resilience within your organisation for 2023. Today's discussion will be full of opportunities for not just our panelists to express their thoughts and opinions, but for you, our audience, to get involved by asking questions using the Ask a Question icon on the right-hand side of your screen. So please put forward your questions to our panel. If you want to ask a question to a specific panelist, then please put their name before your question. So with that, let's bring in our panelists. And joining me today for this conversation, we have Edward Morley. Edward is also a partner and colleague of mine at PA. And Edward spent nearly 10 years working at Network Rail and now works across the transport sector and was the joint author of the recent report that we'll be discussing shortly. Then we have Sarah Ulrich. Sarah is also a partner at PA and specialises in scenario planning, resilience and wargaming. Then we have Mila Mazalu. Mila is a principal program controls manager at Network Rail, and she's going to be talking specifically about some of the recent projects that she has led. We have John Easton. John is an associate professor at the Birmingham Centre for Railway Research. And finally, we have Pragya Raina. Pragya is a program reporting specialist at Network Rail. So thank you all for joining me today and really looking forward to hearing your thoughts and opinions on this topic. And with that, let's get started. So beginning with you, Edward, in your recent RTM reports, the survey results showed that at least 40% of rail organisations recognise the need to become much better at managing their data. Can you begin by setting the scene for us, maybe summarising what the different organisations in the rail sector will be doing regarding their data management?
Sure. Every part of the rail sector uses data to drive insights to how they operate, maintain and renew the railway as a system. However, the sector's broken up into operators and maintainers, and therefore they have different purposes and uses for that data. Operators have relied on and then chosen to use quite subtly the data that they receive on performance and customer data to manage those two areas. And it's interesting how differently you can see in the tones and the shapes of the branding of the various franchises, how they do that. It leads to pockets of insight, but it also sometimes leads to loss of understanding across the sector. From the maintainer side, Network Rail is the GB owner and asset manager. It has a different set of operational and asset management needs for its data to control the system and to manage the asset. The data sets need to be consistent, valid and accurate. And over the last 15 years or so, the sector as a whole, and particularly Network Rail, has invested large sums of money, hundreds of millions of pounds, seeking to do better in that space of collecting, evaluating, collating strong asset data to make better operational and long-term decisions. So for both, the challenge remains to collect the minimum valuable data for the maximum value to answer the question that you're trying to answer. And that starts with knowing the question that you want to answer. So outcomes first.
Thanks, Edward. And I guess as a follow-up, it's fair to say that organisations understand their data is valuable. But the challenge really comes from actually realising tangible insight rather than getting bogged down in data processing and management. What do you think some of the biggest opportunities for organisations to realise greater value from their data are?
So if we look at this from two angles, firstly, let's look at the value of understanding what you're wanting. And second, we will look at the ones and zeros themselves. So firstly, the outcomes you're seeking to achieve and the order and the value that the data that you collect will help you to navigate to that value. And it's, as I say, the least effort for the greatest return. So the first investment is one of time and thinking. What are the questions I want to answer today? What are the questions I want to answer in the future? And what are the data sets that I need to relentlessly capture rigorously and for as long as they add value? Looking beyond the rail sector, you can see in commerce, the likes of Amazon, Tesco's, they've done that, and you can see where they click. No, their ability to understand everything about you is amazing. Will the railway ever get there? Let's see. Secondly, of the ones and zeros themselves, they're worthless unless they're collated, cleansed, evaluated, collated, and rigorously and consistently captured, valid and accurate. Then it makes the analysis that aligns to business outcomes in your business all the easier. But the analysis can only be undertaken from this consistent truth. So investments in two spaces will create opportunity. In the time and the thinking for what you want to respond to, the outcomes, and then the investment in the data itself to give you a basis, strong data management to essentially secure the value of that data as you try to answer the questions.
Thanks. And moving to you, John, to get an academic perspective. A big part of using data is understanding the context in which it's being used, as Edward just said. What role does context play in driving value from data, and how can we capture this context within our data?
Absolutely. So fundamentally, context is everything when it comes to actually using the data downstream. And the further away you get from the point where you're collecting that data, the more important that context is. So without that, you can't trust the decisions that you're making from the data, and it doesn't really matter which bit of the context it is that's missing. I mean, it might be who the owner of the data was, or why the data was originally gathered, or what had happened to it since it was originally gathered. Without that, the decision is still uncertain, if you like. So if I were to try and describe this in perhaps a more accessible way. So if you think about a recipe book application, okay, and in that recipe book application, you have a recipe, and the recipe requires jelly as one of the ingredients. Okay, you need to know whether that is an American recipe book or whether it's a UK recipe book. That piece of context is really important, because otherwise you're going to be making your recipe with either a fruit preserve or a gelatin dessert. Okay, that's why context is really important. Now, the problem with that is that traditionally, when you design software, that context is left to the application developer. So it's left to the person writing the piece of software to make sure that they're using the data that they've imported from wherever they're importing it in an appropriate way. And the data doesn't carry the information with it. There are sets of data models that are being developed that capture that semantic inherently. So they carry the context with them. So this is a set of models called ontologies. They're based on the idea that you have a public model of the world, or the root concepts of the world, that you then extend to describe your data. And along with that common framework that you're speaking in, you also have relationships between the data items that allow you to transfer them from one type of data to another type of data. And by doing that, when you first of all, when you're querying your data, the data is automatically unambiguous because you've got it related to that common view of the world. And if you're querying for an item of data that perhaps is in a slightly different form, then it becomes possible to use the relationships within the model to do the translation between the forms of the data. So you're not reliant on logic in the application, you're reliant on information that you're transferring with the data as part of the data model. So there are lots of really interesting approaches that we can use to do this. Now, obviously, there's an overhead associated with that. The data models themselves become more complicated, and you need to invest a bit of time and a bit of money in setting up the data models in the first place. But the advantage is when you change something in the real world, you're changing it once in your data model rather than lots of times in lots of different software applications.
Thanks, John. And as someone who's married to an American, I can certainly relate to the getting lost in translation when it comes to jelly. But I guess bringing in Miller Pragia, it'd be really interesting to hear your reflections on realizing tangible insight from your recent projects.
Thank you, Dominic. Yes. Well, so Pragya and I are part of a major infrastructure organisation. We're part of Network Rail, and we have a significant level of investment that's being delivered through projects. So our perspective on this is really much more around projects and the way in which they're delivered. And we found that despite significant advances in project management theory over the last 50 years, we do continue to still see projects that are still held back by a number of issues. Data, we feel, is a really core part of this. In Wales and Western, we've been working to address some of the data-specific issues around our projects, and we've achieved some really notable savings, which we'll share in some more detail later. But we believe all organisations can harness more value from their data, and we wanted to illustrate this point really by having a look at the sort of wider project profession. And we've used the National Infrastructure Construction Pipeline. This is a document that was published in 2021 by the Infrastructure and Projects Commission, and it lays out a 10-year plan of investment for the country, and that's got an estimated value of £649 billion, which is an eye-watering amount. Now, if we consider just a modest saving of about 1% to a portfolio of this nature, it would amount to a benefit of £6.5 billion. That's 650 million every year for 10 years that we could potentially reinvest back into projects or into other infrastructure innovations. So it's a very motivating figure, and even though 1% sounds small, it probably is as a percentage, we know that it's not an easy proposition to find those types of efficiencies on projects. We're aware of a number of blockers and enablers to projects and to being able to really harness the value from the data that we collect quite regularly. What I'll do is I'll pass on to Pragya to just outline some of those blockers and enablers for you now.
Thank you, Mila. There are three areas I'll cover, which are on systems, the data environment, and data literacy across the organization. Starting with systems, we do have challenges with systems proliferation, and we recognize this is an issue across the rail industry and not just projects. And we have taken a strategic approach to address this issue, and we identified the systems that were central and serving and connecting to all the other different systems, and we standardized their data first and made them available. And in this process, we also identified the system owners and made them accountable for their data. And as part of systems, we also identified data silos, and we realized that reporting them individually was of less value to the business. And so we bridged them together. We built a centralized reporting platform providing a unified view of the data. And this leads us to the second aspect, which is around data environment. We have always ensured that the data we are picking for our reporting, for our systems, it's correct at the source, and the data is standardized with quality and data ownership in place. This is because even though we use tools like modern business analytical tools, but without data quality in place, the insights produced, the outputs produced they won't be valuable for the organization. And finally, the third aspect, which is around data literacy, we realize that there are variable skills in our organization around analyzing data, understanding its importance, interpretation of information, which should be expanded on. And we don't want everyone to be a data analyst, but we also shouldn't restrict data analysis or data practices to just a department alone. So rather, data analysis and these practices should be embedded across the organization, and we are working hard and to encourage and empower other teams with right tools and knowledge to take this data revolution forward.
Well, and of course, there is a broader opportunity around organizational culture and the way in which data is used and rolled out. When we look at the motivations that surround adoption of project data analytics, and even looking at the role of gut feeling in the decision-making process, the scale of the change that's required in order to transform organizations so that they can invest and get value out of project data analytics. There's a really, really big piece there that I think would be worthy of a longer discussion. For us, the deployment of a data-based initiative, whether that's in projects or elsewhere, isn't just about integrating disparate tools or systems. It's about simultaneous consideration of culture, of data, of skills, as well as the analytical software and hardware that we're using and relying on. Each organization is going to have their own circumstances to consider in this, and we really recommend having a thorough understanding of your own organizational context so that any solutions you develop are tailored to actually fit and answer the challenges that the organization is experiencing. And I think one of the things we'd finally say is that we'd really caution against sort of overselling of data initiatives. I think we've seen quite a lot of glossy strategies with really, really ambitious timescales, which are great, and it's fantastic to see such interest in the field. But we often do see these kind of fizzling out once they really hit the ground, because they are just too big and too much for the organization to handle at once. So our key piece of advice, I think, here is to start with really practical and realistic solutions which are achievable and which solve the underlying problems faced by the organization. We're really focused on doing things right rather than doing things fast. And that's probably what we would leave you with now.
Thank you. And moving back to you, Edward. So, in a perfect non-fragmented sector, what would such sort of consistent outcome data-driven then enable? How could the sector move more towards that?
So accepting everything Miller's just said there about starting simple and keeping stuff in a pragmatic space, the value of that consistency in decision making is part of an essential transition for the rail sector. The real value of benchmarking cost and delivery outturns across the country, the ability to think of the life cycle of an asset using the full breadth of national data insights, not just those that sit in your own patch, and the ability to start to prioritize where the spend goes on a mechanism that really helps drive the maintenance and renewals of the business where it needs. And clearly the rail sector is going to change and transition over the next decade. That need for real-time, consistent and available data is the opportunity to change the capability and indeed the capacity of the network. The digital enablement of the system can only happen with that level of insight that comes from a rich data set, but absolutely consistently and rigorously captured. To answer the question of how it happens in the sector, it's openness, it's trust, it's the new culture. Miller, absolutely agree again. The cultural change, rather than the zeros and the ones, is actually the imperative to what we do, why we do it, which is to bring passengers back to the railway, to start to share a vision and to drive the efficient green transport mode. So the vision's there. The aim has got to be to embed the culture to do it.
Thanks. And bringing you back in, Miller, I mean, our survey respondents identified operational delivery as the parts of the rail sector that are currently making the best use of data. Have you seen any sort of shining examples of where this has happened and people realizing real, proper, tangible value?
Well, what we can tell you about is the work that we've been doing in Wales and Western in a little bit more detail. Our team here have modernized the approach that we've taken to program controls, reporting and analytics. And we've introduced a number of modern techniques, some modern software and some technologies to enable a better informed and a data-informed decision-making process to be used here when we review projects. Despite the compact size of our team, which is only 3, we've had quite a significant and positive impact to the way in which project data is used across the organization. Our team has given back over 29,000 annual hours to project teams across our Wales and Western region. And we've done this by developing a number of systems and tools that make information more accessible, that connect data, that reduce double handling of information, duplication of effort. We automate some of the analysis and provide insights and a little bit of try to work on providing some foresight to the project teams. And Pragya will just give you a few examples of some of the systems that we've developed.
So we had developed a set of automated and consistent reports for the region as against manual generation through Excel. So it's estimated that they are saving around 12,000 annual hours for the project teams, as the teams don't have to log in into different systems, they don't have to download the data, interpret that information themselves, and they don't need to handle any errors and inconsistencies within the data. This means teams are spending their time discussing project issues rather than data issues. And this is our flagship output. And there are other innovations, such as automated method of commentary collection, which is saving around 4,800 annual hours per annum, and a change database which saves around 9,700 hours annually. So beyond this, we have created several curated data sets. We have made them simple and widely accessible to the teams, and encouraging teams to undertake their own data analysis without going through the trouble of getting the data, transforming it, and which saves around 6,500 annual hours for them.
And what we're hoping is that people on this webinar are just listening to us and saying, well, of course, that just makes sense, right? Because a lot of the things that we have done are what we might consider to be quite basic. We are trying to reduce duplication, reduce double handling, and yet we can see that that this wasn't done before us, and is providing quite a significant return of working hours back to our project teams, which can then be reinvested in more meaningful project work. So we really feel we've demonstrated the role of technology through our work as a vital enabler to improving project outcomes. And one of the ways in which we've done that is by using these systems to complement and support project teams. To achieve this, we've taken a really strong pull rather than push approach to rollout. We've never mandated the use of the systems that we've developed, and we've rather worked really hard to make them more effective and valuable to the project teams directly, so that they decide to use the systems we provide, rather than us forcing them or requiring them as part of some kind of controls process. It's been a really core part of our sort of implementation philosophy, and it's something we would really, really strongly recommend to others.
Thank you. And maybe quickly, John, if maybe you want to come in and talk about any other examples that you may have seen across the industry.
Yeah, sure. So Edward, right up at the top, used the phrase "pockets of insight" or something along that around the industry in terms of the use of data, and I thought that was a really insightful phrase, if you like, because I think in terms of what we see from an academic perspective, that is exactly what's going on. There are loads of little projects, all funded by 30k here or 40k there, which are doing all sorts of interesting things dotted around the industry. I mean, if I had to pick an example, I'm an engineer, so I'd pick something out of the engineering part of the world, although actually I've always had a sneaking suspicion there's quite a lot of work being done with customer data, for example, that perhaps we don't see as often as people outside of commercial entities, because that stuff is of value and protected. But for example, there's stuff that Porterbrook have been doing, working with a company called Iotics, where Iotics have provided them with an engine where Porterbrook can make GPS details for the vehicles available into that engine. They can then merge that with data that's coming from open train times, which is giving them information about the head codes and the service that's being run and all that sort of thing. And then that information can be made available to, for example, Network Rail. But all of the organizations that are involved in this are retaining the control of their own data. They're able to pull the plug on that at any time, because the feed that goes into the Arctics platform isn't really being held in the Arctics platform. It's just being passed through it as it's being integrated. So there are all sorts of interesting little activities like that are going on, which I don't think as an industry we're necessarily as good at keeping track of as perhaps we should be. Now, in terms of things around value that I think we are probably all more aware of, there is of course the stuff around the rail data marketplace and the stuff that RDG have been leading in that area, around being able to make data available and regardless of where you sit within the industry in terms of how or whether even data should be commoditized or whether it should be being made available for industry good. I think the fact that we're getting to a stage where we finally do sort of have some of these industry recognized platforms, if you like, where we can start to exchange some of these data sets outside of the confines of our individual organizations is probably a very good thing, regardless of whether it's technically quite the right solution. It's certainly a step in the right direction.
Finally, before we go to one of our first live polls, I mean, Edward, insufficient specialist staff was identified by respondents in the recent survey as being one of the main barriers stopping organisations from realising more value from data. What do you think some of the practical steps organisations can do to overcome this?
Yeah, so far I've talked lots about that transforming of data management ones and zeros. So let me pick up on some of the stuff Sally says in the report. That you need the investment, but the process starts by shifting people, by finding what is going to be their education, to upskilling the existing staff, and indeed to recruiting where necessary. There is a massive amount of technical insight in the rail sector, but there's an aging workforce. There's a historical understanding of my patch in the expertise. To get the value before it's lost, the data management is necessary, but the business and the sector as a whole need to recruit and encourage that sort of digitally native talent that exists in just every day. We need to recognize that the greatest diversity in digital skills comes if we bring people into the business. But as Pragya and Miller have already been talking about, there are data-led approaches to upskilling, the development of insight tools, the visualization, the manipulators of data. And again, John said the same, they don't break the truth, but they allow people to play within a sphere, a place of safety, to learn and develop their own capability in decision-making and thinking, a nice loop. The data is consistently held, it's rigorous, it's valid, but you're upskilling others. And that happens when anyone is engaged in what's in it for us. Is that got to be the humanization of that value, the alignment to the overall performance, the climate change, the passenger satisfaction, whatever that might be. Experience tells us that employers under pressure to get more done welcome the data that helps them. It helps them function more effectively. And we've seen wonderful stats already, the hours given back to project teams actually help them do themselves. So we found that when we help our clients, bringing data back to the all-important human factors is absolutely an essential part to making that happen.
Thanks. And we're now going to launch the first of our live polls. So at the beginning, we mentioned we've recently undertaken a joint PA RTM survey, and it's been of over 150 people across the rail industry. And the results are set out in a recently released report. It's called Insight Rich and Value Driven, a New Vision for Rail. And we thought we'd maybe just take this opportunity to test and validate some of the key findings. So if we can put the first poll up, which is around how well does your organisation manage their data to realise value? And we'll come back to the results in a few minutes once people have had a chance to respond. But I'd like to move us on a little bit now. And Sarah, you've been sitting there very patiently. So I'd like to come to you next and maybe talk a little bit around resilience. So, given the almost unprecedented amount of uncertainty in the rail sector, for example, due to the evolving demand post-COVID, workforce and supply changes, and even more recently, the sort of greater amount of economic instability, what do you see as the critical data approaches to managing this uncertainty and building organizational resilience?
Thanks, Dom. And interestingly, one of the words of 2022 that went into the dictionary was perma-crisis. So it's really like a sign that we have entered a new world of resilience where we are seeing multiple major incidents and crises happening at the same time and with an increased frequency. And it's not this old world anymore. So the pre-COVID or 3 years ago, where you had one major incident or one crisis and you move on to the next one, etc. But there is a time lapse in between. It's always on. And in that new always on world, it's very important that you have to shift. You have to do a different way of dealing with resilience. And what we often quote as perma-resilience. And this has to be translated, this perma-resilience, into the plans, reviewing the plans and processes to make sure they are fit with this compounding perma-crisis, but also a new resilience mindset. And that is also quite critical for, obviously, the citizens, but also all employees of organizations, and also building resilience across your entire ecosystem. That is a really, really important thing too as well, to not necessarily look at breaking the silos within your own organization, but thinking of your third parties and even obviously across your mode of transport and the wider transport sector too. And this also means, Dom, a greater importance having a data-led approach. And it has two parts to that. One, which is really building an intelligence-led resilience. And the second part is building an evidence-led resilience. So what does it mean, intelligence-led resilience? It's really about looking at building intelligence-led culture within the organizations. Also, there is a big organizational cultural element. So we talked about that mindset shift needed. And also thinking about where to obtain the data and how to engage across the ecosystem. So on those 4 points, I'm just going to give you a whiz tour. On the intelligence-led culture, it's really important from a kind of op model structure within the organization to have obviously responsible intelligence officers of some sort, of having a correct intelligence life cycle, but also integrating business processes. It's quite important that you think about how that intelligence collection of data works and how you process it, obviously. And also being clear, very important around the regulations and external expectations. So obviously there is a lot about GDPR, the CAA, but also the Freedom of Information Act, etc. So it's really important to look at what is the world, obviously your organization that you are living in. The important thing as well, I know as mentioned by Mila as well, so we have there is a common thread to what we are saying, is really about this cultural element within the organization. You need to be able to understand and use the data to create a psychologically safe environment. Because in the kind of, when you want to build resilience, it's really about being able to talk about the failures, about what has not worked, and really being open about that you are not going to be judged or have a performance review, on whatever you're doing. So having that safety, psychological safety, to engage and talk about those things will really actually help embed and enhance this intelligence-led culture. Also, an important thing, Dom, is to think about where to obtain that data from a resilience perspective. So the major one, what we have seen work quite well, is through a tailored kind of wargaming exercising program, because then you test the as-is processes and plans and you gather raw data on what works and what doesn't. And that is really something that is also non-threatening, because you are actually doing something, and everybody at all levels is able to also contribute to that. And also the last point I was mentioning about engaging with your wider ecosystem. So engaging with your third parties, so your suppliers and your partners, is absolutely critical in this new world of always on resilience, to be able to prevent and be able to actually work better together. So that is quite critical, Dom.
Thanks, Sarah. And I guess just going into a little bit more detail, you mentioned this evidence-led resilience approach. Maybe you could expand and tell us a little bit more.
Yes, sure. And this is what I mean as well by that. So once you have the data, you really need to prove and have the data to confirm how you move from one level of resilience maturity to the next. So the kind of maturity roadmap or pathway or train track, should I say today, that you need to actually move forward. But you need to be able to prove that you have done certain things and you can go to the next gate and the next milestone, etc. So that is quite important, to turn the data into actionable knowledge, to gather the data continuously. That's the second point. And the third one is you need to embed it into a robust continuous improvement and risk management loop. So it's not just gathering everything to gather everything. It's really actually how it feeds within your own systems of managing risks and your continuous learning processes around that. So turning data into actionable knowledge. So really important from a data and resilience perspective to set well thought through KPIs and KRIs, so key risk indicators, with bespoke, like we mentioned, linked to your bespoke intelligence models and processes, and really planning for a dedicated intelligence team that can validate and build that knowledge and that actually can translate it into evidence on how you are progressing. So gathering the data continuously is quite an interesting one. You obviously can have KPIs on certain aspects that are linked with your maturity levels. And there are different grids and frameworks depending on where you sit, depending on the modes of transport. But one important one as well, again, that we have seen is once you have done those wargaming exercises with your as-is processes, you come at it again once you had a chance to improve them, and you stress test them to see how it has progressed or where do you need to refine it a bit more. But all this is meaningless if it's not embedded in a continuous improvement loop and where the data is being validated and it helps inform and being communicated properly across the organization. So horizontally between different functions, but also vertically. And that can only be done with a proper communication and awareness plan, with program delivery and change management supporting that. And really, it happens over time. It's not a quick fix. But Dom, this is the kind of importance of the intelligent, evidence-led resilience approach and how data can help.
Thanks, Sarah. And bringing in you, John, it'd be interesting from your research and experience, what changes are you seeing across the industry to improve resilience and manage uncertainty?
So I guess from an academic point of view, the interesting thing about resilience is there are always two sides to it. So you have resilience in terms of your data and your data infrastructure, and you have the resilience of the system that you're trying to model and you're trying to ask questions about. And from perspective of the sort of the system, the thing that I guess that's easiest to talk about resilience about is about perhaps the infrastructure and climate and things like that. And actually, that's a really good example of where you can put a problem in front of somebody and actually explain to them how things like machine learning work in a practical sense. So if you think about your infrastructure, and you think about the traditional way that we'd manage the infrastructure, and you would have someone who'd been working a stretch of track, and he'd been there for his whole career, he'd been there for 40 years, and he understood consciously or subconsciously particular patterns in the climate and things like that that would lead to issues with that piece of the infrastructure. Okay, and fundamentally what he's seeing is, he's seeing a wet period followed by a cold period, and then he's seeing movement of the track or whatever it might be, and he knows that's going to happen. Now, the interesting thing about machine learning is the machine learning approach to doing that is doing exactly the same thing. It's just it's looking for those patterns in a different way to the way that your guy who's looking after the track is looking for the pattern. So really, resilience from that side of things is just about understanding what those patterns are and then understanding how a particular shift in the environment is going to alter the patterns over the long term. The problem with that sort of thing is, of course, these things always come as a bit of an emergency, in a bit of a hurry. And so you're probably, as part of your learning and your thinking around those patterns, having to rely on proxy measures and variables that aren't designed to describe those features as part of your machine learning. And I think around the railways, particularly as a result, for example, of COVID or as a result of climate change, what we're starting to see is people thinking differently about how they're using the data to solve those problems. So, for example, if you think about COVID and you're thinking about recovering ridership, well, maybe the interesting thing is obviously the number of people on the trains. If you don't necessarily know that, well, maybe there are other measures that you can use to come up with that data and to help you predict it. So maybe, for example, you can look at the ticketing data and see roughly how many people in one area of the country are likely to make a journey between two cities. Maybe there are other things that you can look at in terms of the information that they're accessing from National Rail inquiries or things like that to help you have some sort of understanding of what's going on there. But as I say, from a resilience point of view, it's really those proxies that I think are the interesting thing going forward.
Thanks, John. And Sarah, we know you've got an upcoming report coming out where you highlight a shift in perception. So from ad hoc responses to a point where leaders are seeing resilience as an important part of creating competitive advantage. Can you give us an early view on some of the key findings?
Yes, Dom, a sneak peek only just for you today as it will be released next month. But two interesting points overall for the transport sector, but also I will give you some insights around the rail sector. Overall, it was really interesting. We surveyed over 360 transport leaders across Europe. And we also conducted multiple senior leaders qualitative interviews. And over 60% rated that organizational resilience is now excellent or good. And it was up from 45% from 3 years ago. So it was interesting because we are trying to look back of what has happened with the change to a perma crisis and then looking forward to what kind of lessons learned will be applied. So 60% is quite interesting. And almost 9 in 10 said as well that resilience is now a strategic imperative at board level. So it seems like good news. In the rail subsector, so that was quite interesting too, they see resilience as a strategic imperative. So this has shifted. But the lowest performing aspect in the resilience life cycle, interestingly for rail, is the prevent phase, so preparedness. And they are also evenly split, it seems, in the rail sector, in over being resilient through design or being resilient through experience. So it's really 50-50. That is quite interesting compared to other modes of transport, which indicates that resilience is still being reactive to events and not proactively tackled. So there is also a lot around this that will come out with the report. And also for the rail subsector, 35% only see resilience as an investment being increased in the next 3 years. That is a bit worrying in the sense that the areas where they think it's worth investing, of those 35% who said that we should invest, is leadership, data, and insights. But the lowest performing pillar is technology and automation. And they don't think it's worth investing there. So this underlines again, Dom, the importance of considering linking data and resilience as part of an agenda for change for rail. So hopefully more to come next month.
And thanks, Sarah. Thanks for sharing those insights. So we're going to close the first live poll, and we can bring the results up and then start our second poll. So do we get to see the results? Okay, so 44% requires improvement and only 16% being extremely effective. So we're now going to start our second poll, which again is building on some of the research that we did previously. And this second poll is around what the main barriers that are blocking your organization from realizing more value from data. And we'll come back to those results in a few minutes' time. So final question, and I guess this goes to all panelists, but maybe we'll start with you, Edward. And this is thinking about where the industry will be in 10 years' time in terms of how it uses data. You know, will we be up there with the Amazons, the Airbnbs using data to offer innovative services, customized services, or do you think we're still going to be struggling to sort of processing basic data? And what do you think some of the biggest changes which need to occur to help get us there? Edward.
So I think I'd say, so if we look in a decade's time, HS2 will have opened London to Birmingham. West Coast South will therefore be a very different offering. HS1 as a route will be moving towards heavy renewals for the first time and making big decisions. The East West Railway will have been open for into its second control period by then. The railway will definitely be different from today. However, if we look back a decade and therefore going forward a decade, I think it would be foolish to say that the rail sector is going to become the next Amazon, knowing everything about every moving part of the railway. But I do truly believe that data will be an increasingly valuable and valued asset. I believe that there'll be more dynamic management of the linear assets, and it will be essential and successfully happening in order to enable dynamic maintenance schedules, which will enable dynamic timetabling. I believe that data decision making, together with the adoption of the tools, the culture, and the machines that support it, will make the railway safer, smarter, and a thoroughly exciting place to work.
Thanks, Edward. Bringing in Miller of Pragya, as people who work in Network Rail at the moment, I'd be interested in understanding your views of where we're going to be in 10 years.
Well, I might say that I already think we're better than the Amazons and the Netflixes. I think we have a much more complex proposition here, a much more complex industry to work within. And so I think in my view, we're already dealing with larger amounts of uncertainty and complexity than many kind of standard FANG type technology industries will face. And I really believe that we're doing a lot better. But I think one of the angles I'd like to pick up on, to build on Edward's point, is around people. I think area where we're going to see a lot of changes over the coming decade. I think you mentioned earlier, Edward, about the railway industry, and we really want to just reinforce that point. Actually, it's really well established. It's got very mature approaches for project delivery, which is of course very important. But these large structures can become quite slow to respond to changing circumstances, and so we're still operating with, for example, roles and job descriptions which are rooted in working practices that are more than a decade old and aren't necessarily reflective of the modern approaches that we need to use now. So to really be able to leverage new technology from now over the next coming 10 years, I think where we really need to focus is to establish different skills within our roles and look at robust data to modernize the way in which we get more benefit out of the data that we incidentally seem to capture anyway. And I think this does need to be tackled organizationally through skill changes and modern approaches to recruitment and retention. And I think this is frankly an area where data-enabled organizations have probably leapfrogged the rail industry. I think there's more recognition in the likes of Apple and Netflix and so on about how important people who are skilled in this area are to those organizations, and they are far more focused on attraction, retention, and so on. But beyond the kind of basic models of reward and recognition, we also feel it's important for wider recognition through sort of professional associations and professional kind of backgrounds and means. So Pragya and I have found it very rewarding to be winners at a number of awards last year, which were very data-focused awards. We had the British Data Awards, and we were successful there, and we had the British Computing Society Awards, and we were successful there as well. So I'll just do a little toot on our trumpet for that. Pragya's, nominated at the National Apprenticeship Awards this year. So I think that there are three kind of categories there, three fields there where we've been able to find categories that are reflective of the work that we're doing. But one thing we've noticed is that there aren't really categories within the railway specific environment, like awards circuit or professional associations, that actually give the opportunity for data focused people to gain recognition in that respect. So I think this is an area that would be worth reviewing and considering a little bit further in the context of the sort of wider railway industry, for sure. I think Pragya is going to just take us further and just think a bit forward now about the next 10 to 15 years by starting by looking back, really.
Yeah, and if we take this further and consider how things were done like 10 to 15 years ago, we can recognize that there has been a significant change in this area, and this only seems to be speeding up. So we are already reaping the benefits of data-driven decision making, and with the ongoing data revolution, irrespective of whether an organization is traditional one or like data native, more and more of them, including the rail organization, will continue to invest in into data analytics and be part of the data-driven culture. And with adoption of tools like cloud-based systems, sophisticated AI technologies, and powerful business intelligence solutions will enable us to envision future, interrogate our history, and understand our the customers better, and thus help us provide safer and better services. And there's another angle that all these things, the changing environment drives the need for professional curiosity and professional development. And so we always look for ways of maintaining and developing our knowledge. And this can be done through various ways, from like trainings, workshops, through apprenticeship programs, knowledge sharing groups, and working with professional associations.
And of course, this is all about people. Ultimately, it's about people having the right skills in order to be able to take us forward over the next 10 years. So I'm really won't pass up an opportunity to encourage people to actually take an active interest and work really closely with professional associations, with their professional associations, and also look a little bit more widely into how they can expand their own data skill set. So I've been a volunteer with my professional association, the Association for Project Management, for a number of years, and I've found it a very rewarding and very educating experience across all facets of the organization that I've been involved with. So I think the one thing that Pragya and I would like to leave you with as a focus for the next 10 years is that we believe it's about people, and it's about people retaining that professional curiosity and developing their skill sets in order to align to being able to harness the value of these technologies and the value of this data that we're just capturing across, whether it be our projects or our organizations or our assets.
Thank you. I'm just acutely aware of time, so I'm going to suggest that we quickly bring up our second live poll. So let me scroll down and look at the results quickly, and then I want to open up for any final questions. So the main barriers, quite a few that are reasonably similar. So 20-odd% insufficient specialist staff, 20-odd% lack of leadership buy-in, not considered a priority. So yeah, some interesting results, and really good to get the live polls to validate some of our primary research. In the last couple of minutes, I just want to make sure we maybe just tip over to have a look quickly at some of the Q&A. So there's the first question here, and I appreciate we're probably not going to have time to answer too many, but there's a question around who do we believe should own the data? And I guess that's part of the sort of fragmentation that we were speaking about earlier. So I don't know whether, Edward, you want to come in and maybe have a first pass.
Who do you believe should own the data, considered the client that pays for the service, the provider of the data, the source provider of the data, and the controller of the data? There is some data that is a tax, in my mind, and there is some data that will be specific to individuals. I would have thought that a consistency of asset data across the fundamental building blocks of the rail system functionally helps everybody make better decisions to operate, maintain, and renew Network Rail. I think that train operators will still want specific things, but in a world, let's see what happens this evening, of GBR going forward, I still think there's an entity in the centre, an authority, capital A, who will own and manage that data, who will be tasked to manage it prudently, to put it on the P&L, to consider it a valuable asset in its own right, and expect it to return value accordingly. So in this instance of the rail sector, I would place that in the GBR Network Rail sphere.
And as a similar question, I'll maybe hand over to you, John, which is around how do you think the current industry structure, so Network Rail, TOCs, FOCs, limit the industry's ability to utilize data?
So there are some fairly obvious problems here. So at the moment, we have a situation where all of these things are independent commercial entities to a large extent, and we've heard a lot throughout the course of the last hour about the fact that when we're gathering data, there are costs associated with the gathering of the data. There are costs associated with maintaining of the data. There are costs associated with simply pushing data out down the pipe to someone else's computer somewhere else in the industry, and so the situation we have where those are private commercial entities who are bearing those costs is obviously going to be restrictive, because you then need to start thinking up commercial arrangements around who can access that data. So you can be able to start to recover some of that as the organization who's gathering and maintaining the data source in the first place. Now, I think the interesting question here is whether there are some more automated methods that we can use to build up audits of those data value chains. And there's stuff that we do here from a research perspective, for example, around distributed ledgers, that actually has a lot of promise in that area, in situations where we're not talking about the sorts of data that should be being covered as an industry resource, if you like, in the way that Edward was just talking about, but stuff that is very much only of interest to a few players, and needs to be collected by an organization which isn't going to be the organization that's getting the majority of the financial benefit from that collection.
Thanks, John. I'm going to squeeze in one very quick final one, which is around which data is the most important to start with: transportation, logistics, customer information, procurement. Maybe Miller, you can give us a very quick response to this one.
I think, well, start with what you have. I think is probably where I would initially guide people. I think we recognize that lots of organizations already have access to significant body of data within their own sphere of influence, and so have a look at what you're already capturing and using actively, and I would say, you know, assess whether this is something that you wish to continue capturing, because as John said, there is a cost associated with every little bit of bytes that we are storing. Every single data byte that's being stored will have some cost and some impact somewhere. So look at what you have. Review that against what you think you need in order for your organization to be successful. Review this gap that you may have between where you are and where you want to be, and then start to develop the gaps, because we recognize that there will often be gaps. So I can't come out and say it's one or the other. I've put forward a view that I think if we were to improve project outcomes through, you know, even this 1% of improvement on the government portfolio, that would give us 6.5 billion potentially, or could give as much as 6.5 billion back. I'd say sort projects out, because that's where my interest is. But we could equally create value in various assets and within many organizations in lots of different ways. So I can't say it would be one or the other, but always pays to start with what you have, because there's a lot that's being captured and maybe not quite being harnessed through to true insight and foresight, and that might be a really good way to start.
Thank you, and I think some really good practical, pragmatic advice in that one. So we are just about out of time, so I'd just like to finish by firstly thanking all of our panelists for joining us today and providing that insight, and also to everybody who's joined us on this webinar. I hope you found it a very useful conversation. So thank you very much for joining us today. Hope you enjoyed it, and goodbye.